Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I would like to discuss something very important. If you have listened to some of the previous lessons, you'll notice that I recommend do this, do that, occupy an open file, or capture the opponent's pieces when you can for free, or look out for a fork and pin, and the king's safety, and the list goes on and on and on. However, the big question is, at beginner level, but also at intermediate or advanced, or even oftentimes at master or grandmaster level, which of those things that we all know are important are the priority in one given position? And that is the subject I'd like to discuss in this particular lesson. Let me show you the first example that I'd like to illustrate what are important, or what are the priorities rather, in a position. Here we are in our first example, which is a relatively simple pawn endgame when there are no other pieces on the board but the kings on each side, and white having 4 pawns, black having 5 pawns. Now, of course, in a situation like this, it's extremely important whose turn it is, because the evaluation is rather different depending who's to move. Well, it's white's turn, and white has a very natural move, and that is to capture the opponent's pawn on b5 that is not protected. And typically speaking, I would say capture your opponent's pieces whenever you can for free. However, this is one of those occasions when that would be a major mistake and would throw the game away. In this case, the priority is to promote your passed pawn. It's more important, that ultimate goal, rather than winning a pawn for now. So white has two options, either to push the pawn ahead or to capture the pawn. Now it seems that both are accomplishing towards that goal as of promoting that passed A pawn, whether it will be on the A file or on the B file. There is a major difference, however. If white indeed captures the pawn on B5, it's not hard to get convinced that the black king is close enough to catch the pawn just on time. And then, of course, when the pawn promotes, the black king just captures the newly crowned queen. Now, let's see how A5 compares to this. It's indeed a major difference because, as we know, the pawns are advancing one at a time, and so is the black king nearing towards the promotion square, one square at a time. And here we'll see that the black king is just one move too late in catching that white passed pawn. So, the bottom line is, in our starting position, it's much better to push the pawn forward instead of capturing the pawn on b5, because in the first case the pawn gets across, gets promoted, white will have an extra queen, while after capturing the pawn, white would win a pawn. However, the pawn will never get promoted if black defends correctly, and white will not win the game. Let's move on to a different example. Here we go. In this position, black has significant material advantage. It's not hard to notice that black has a rook and a knight, while white doesn't. And the rest of the material is completely equal. Now, if you look at the position, you can notice something important, that black has an unprotected piece which the white queen can capture in this position. And that is, of course, the knight on c6. However, it's also obvious that if white would indeed move his queen and capture that knight, black would be still an entire rook ahead. If white wouldn't have a better move, then of course white should capture the knight and, well, at least make the material advantage of black less. However, we can see a very far advanced strong pawn on h6, and that can aid the white queen in trying to checkmate black immediately after queen f6. Now the white queen is threatening to come in to g7 and checkmate. Obviously, checkmating is always coming ahead of winning material. If you're looking at a priority scale, first comes always the opportunity to checkmate, or on the other hand, avoiding getting checkmated. Second comes winning material. And third comes only the other strategical type of important things. In this case, black can avoid a checkmate on g7 only by giving their own queen up, which of course is a sad thing because now white is clearly better. Let's move on to our next example. And in this position, it is black's turn. What's important in this position? First of all, it's important to notice that the black bishop on c6 is under attack. So black needs to do something about it. I may have mentioned in one of the previous lessons that in general, do not give up a bishop for a knight if you have an option to avoid it. This is one of those situations when I would recommend indeed to trade your bishop for a knight. And the reason for that is because after the trade on f3, white will be better off capturing your bishop, and that would mean that the pawn structure is ruined. Now, let me mention from white's perspective. I've seen a good number of examples when beginner players, in a situation like this, remembering that I taught them, don't ruin your pawn structure, or don't open up the defense in front of your king. And they would not capture the bishop for those reasons. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, the order of priorities always is first relating to checkmate, second relating to material, and only far and much behind in third place come issues such as ruining the pawn structure or weakening some squares in front of your king. So naturally, if your choice is to remain a piece behind, which would be the case here unless white captures the bishop here, naturally you'd want to capture the bishop. You do not want to stay a piece behind. Let's move on to another example. And here we go. In this position, black at the moment is a bishop ahead, while having two rooks versus a queen. Another important issue that I'd like to point out that inexperienced players make a mistake with, and that is that the inexperienced players, when they see an opportunity to give a check, they usually are very pleased and go for it. In this case, white has an opportunity not only to give a check, but in addition to capture a pawn. However, I have to say that this is a mistake. And it also reminds me of the important advice that when you see a good move, wait, stop, and look See if you have a better one. While if white would not have the move that they should play, this would be the second best move. That's true. But instead of giving a check, even if it involves winning a pawn as well, it's much better to win a more valuable piece, such as the opponent's bishop. So the correct move here is capturing the bishop on f7 rather than just a pawn. So remember, giving a check in itself doesn't mean anything. All it means that it limits the choices of the opponent, but it does not mean at all that it's a good move. Let's move on to our next example, where black again is a piece ahead. And it's black's turn in this moment, and we can notice that the white rook at the moment is attacking our queen. So therefore, we need to react to that. The question is how? You may also say, but the white rook is unprotected, and therefore we cannot give checkmate, so let's go for priority number 2. Let's capture the opponent's rook. However, it's extremely, extremely important to not only consider the priorities for your own gains, but also from the defensive side. Meaning, you want to make sure along the way that you gain material or positional advantages, you're not going to get checkmated, which would be the case right here. The white queen could just move down to f8 and game over. Despite black being a rook and knight ahead, black lost. Okay, so first of all, we realized the queen has no time at the moment capturing the white rook, because white would give checkmate. The next question is how to avoid the checkmate and what should we play? Well, in this case, black has a number of ways to continue that would avoid a checkmate. Probably the simplest would be to give a check, keeping white busy, and then black could, for example, move his rook back to the 8th rank, or a number of other moves, making sure that white will not give checkmate. Also, moving the queen to f6 would certainly be reasonable, as we know when we are ahead in material, which black clearly is in this case, ahead a knight, trade of pieces, especially queens, is favoring the side having material advantage. Just an important little tidbit, that if in this position white would capture the black knight, that would be a tricky move. Not a good one, but a little bit tricky, and a good example that it's never too late to make a mistake. In this case, black has 2 ways to capture the white queen. One of them is winning, and the other one is losing right away. Hopefully, you'll pick the right one, which is the rook. Capturing with the queen would be a major blunder, allowing a quick checkmate after rook d8. Let's go on and move to the next example. Here we are. In this position, black has a significant material advantage, having an extra knight and 2 pawns. However, it is white's turn, and it's quite clear that white has an opportunity to win a pawn back by capturing a pawn on d5 and attacking the bishop on d7. Again, a perfect example. When you see a good move, don't stop there. See if you have an even better one. Because it's true that white won a pawn back, but nevertheless, Black would have still major material advantage. That would be only a matter of time that Black will convert to a full point. On the other hand, if you did look for a better move, I bet you can find an attacking move that puts Black in front of undefendable checkmate threat. Now the white rook is about to run up to h8 and checkmate the Black king. Black can delay the end only by a couple of moves, for example, blocking the rook's way, when naturally white would capture, not with the pawn, but with the rook, to maintain the threat to checkmate on h8, against which Black has no real defense. Let's move on to a similar position. In this example, white is threatening to checkmate the same way we saw in the very last example. However, the catch is that it's Black's turn right now. I always say, look out for the pieces of the opponent that you can capture. And generally speaking, when you have an option to capture more than one of your opponent's pieces, see which one is more valuable. Of course, as we know, on the value scale, the pawn is the least valuable, while the queen the most valuable, being 9 points, clearly more than a rook, which would be only 5 points. And that's not even considering the possibility that you may lose a piece after capturing a rook. That would be then even less of a gain. However, in this case, it's an exception, because following the advice of capturing the most valuable piece would be a blunder, because that would allow the checkmate. Remember the order of priorities. The safety of your king, avoiding getting checkmated, is always a number one priority. On the other hand, if Black chooses to capture the piece of lesser value, namely the rook, even if it means that Black will also lose his bishop, it's still a much better choice, and in fact would leave Black with a clear material advantage and easily won position. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, it's Black's turn. As always, the first step is to try to figure out what does your opponent want to do. And if you think carefully about that, you'll notice that the white knight is aiming at the Black bishop. That Black bishop is under attack. Black has two choices: either to run away with the bishop or try to defend it with one of the other pieces. Well, let's look at the position now from Black's perspective. In addition to answering to white's threat, Black can look around and try to see if is there a way to win material. And you may notice that the Black bishop can indeed capture a pawn on a2. However, this is a very important motif that I'd like you to remember, that such and similar pawn hunting is extremely dangerous when your opponent still has a pawn next to the side pawn that has been captured. In this case, white will have the opportunity to play b3 and with that close off the retreat of that very bishop that just captured a pawn. And what that means is that the white rook is ready to move to the corner next, trapping the bishop. and that wouldn't be a good deal. Even if the black bishop will end up capturing a second pawn on b3, it still would mean that after white captures the bishop, white will gain material because the bishop is worth 3 points, while each pawn only 1. So what should black do in this position? Should they move the bishop somewhere else, or should they move their king or rook, protecting the bishop? While it's certainly okay to move the king, I would probably prefer moving the bishop away to c4 in this case and attack the white rook and gain time with that. But what's really important is that it was a priority not to lose our bishop and therefore not to capture the pawn on a2. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this endgame, white has a very obvious move. White can capture a rook on e5. Again, I remind you over and over, when you have a good move that you see, don't rush making it. Try to see and figure out if you may have an even better one. And indeed, that is the case here. If white would capture the rook, in fact, white wouldn't even really win the rook, because after the check with the bishop on f4, black would immediately win the white rook back on e5. On the other hand, here white can force checkmate with the 2 rooks on the 7th rank in just 3 moves. With a check first, forcing the black king to the corner, a second check, and then the next rook comes and checkmates. A very nice checkmate. Let's move on to our next example. In this position, white has a far advanced passed pawn on d6. However, if you listen to my advice, always look out for your opponent's threats. And in this case, in addition to attacking the pawn on d6, black has another serious threat, namely moving that knight from f5 to e3, which would be a fork attacking the white king and rook. So what should white do? Should white focus and make sure they don't get the fork and lose their rook and give up on their pawn rather? Or should they do something else? Generally speaking, if the choice is between losing a pawn or losing a rook, even if for a knight, you'd rather lose a pawn. However, in this case, the priority is the far advanced passed pawn, and white can and should push their pawn ahead, about to promote, and then in comparison to having a pawn promoted, losing a rook is just a minor detail. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, black at the moment has major material advantage, having his queen still on the board. However, white actually has 2 different ways to win the black queen, but one of them is clearly better than the other. If you look carefully, you'll notice that white can create a pin here, out of which the black queen has no way out. If you look further, you should also notice that white can give a fork with his knight. So, the question is, which is a better choice? Moving the bishop to c4, creating a pin, or moving the knight to f6 and creating a fork? The correct choice is moving the knight to f6. Why? Because if instead the bishop moves to c4, which would be clearly the second best move in the position, black would have the opportunity to get a piece for his queen. While if white makes the correct move after knight f6 and then capturing the queen, black doesn't get anything, lost the queen for nothing. Let's move on to our next position. Here we go. In this position, again, it's quite clear that white could capture the opponent's bishop. However, as I keep mentioning over and over, it's always extremely important to be aware what does our opponent want to do. And in this case, our opponent wants to capture our rook in the corner, and that wouldn't be a good deal, to get a bishop and lose a rook. So what should white do? Should white worry about the rook and move it away from the attack? Or can white do something better? It's always very important that you look out for your best possible move, not just the first or most obvious one. And in this case, if you search further, I bet you can find the fork that white had at his disposal, and then after the black king moves away, white is ready to capture the black queen. And our final example, which is more of a strategical kind, white is in a check. And in this case, white has to choose between blocking the check or moving his king out of the check. As we know, if you move your king, that means that you lose the right to castle for this game. So should white rather block the check and maintain the right to castle? The answer is no, because white will lose material, the pinned bishop will be immediately attacked and be lost. Again, as I mentioned, the order of priorities are checkmate, then material, and only then those other issues such as losing the right to castle or having the pair of bishops and those other elements that I mentioned time to time. So in this case, white's better choice is moving the king to f1 and at least maintain the material balance. Well, I hope you remember this important advice, and I wish you good luck in your games, hopefully choosing the right priorities. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.